Good afternoon, everyone. This is Samir Melki. I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts. I would like to thank Dr. Anbari for inviting me again to the Oman meeting. It's a pleasure and an honor. Today, I'm going to discuss Lasik complications. So instead of talking about multiple complications, I'm going to focus on 3 of them. Let me share my screen with you. So first, I have no financial interests in this talk. These are my general disclosures. The only tiny financial interest is the book about LASIK emergencies. I will discuss that later in the talk and see how that could be useful for you. So the 3 complications I'm going to focus on today are sticky flaps, epithelial ingrowth, and flap folds. So sticky flaps can happen during LASIK, and in this particular situation, you see that there is an area that is not lifting easily. So usually what I do is that I gently lift the flap, and to make sure that I can safely detach the flap from that little adhesion. And most of the time I'm able to, especially if it's outside the visual axis. You just have to be very careful and go very, very slowly to make sure you don't induce any flap tear. So in this particular situation, by being a little bit forceful, you're able to do it, no problem. On other occasions, being forceful is really not a good idea. So here's a flap that's kind of sticky, and I believe this was one of my fellows, if I'm not mistaken, and he's pushing, and you see that he induces a flap tear. So being forceful is not always a good idea. This is another situation that is relatively common. 1 second, this one here. And so sometimes the flap, the side cut does not work, does not cut as well as it should, as in this particular case. So it's no harm to then take matters in your own hands and use finesse scissors to cut that area. So when you do that, it's better to make like 1 cut and not many. So 1 or 2 cuts at most. This way you have like a clean cut, and the flap would go back to the exact same position. Epithelial ingrowth. So this happens post-operatively. This is an example of epithelial ingrowth. This is kind of an advanced ingrowth. Many times it's less than that. So here's another example. Usually it starts obviously at the edge of the flap, and many times it is beyond what you can see. This is a good example where most of the ingrowth is in white, but you have a leading edge that sometimes cannot be appreciated very well. You have to look for it. So the ingrowth is always more than what you expect. And if you stain, you will see on occasion where the cells are going in from. So all this staining is cells. It's a fistula basically, where the epithelial cells are able to get in through an epithelial defect. Sometimes these fistulas are just little tiny pinpoint. So anytime you see an epi ingrowth, stain with fluorescein to see if there is a fistula, because then that tells you that that's in an ongoing process. Sometimes it's easier to see an epithelial ingrowth in retro-illumination. And on occasion, if you want to follow an ingrowth, you can do also corneal densitometry with the pentacam or any other topographer that can do that, and that gives you an objective measure of the ingrowth. As far as removing the ingrowth, sometimes you just have to lift the flap. In this particular case, this was a recurrent ingrowth, and I was planning ahead of time that I was going to put some stitches. So, so you lift the flap, make sure that the area of the ingrowth, sometimes it's a little bit sticky. So there may be some melting of the cornea in that case. And in that particular situation, you want to make sure that you lift very gently so you avoid any flap tears. So once you lift the flap, you have to scrape it on both sides. Usually I start with like a dry Wexel And then any spatula can be used to just clean the ingrowth. And like I said, make sure you clean it from both sides of the flap. And then in a recurrent ingrowth like this, you want to make sure the flap is really tacked down. So you put it down, irrigate, and then you place 10-0 nylon sutures. So in the area where you know the fistula is, you can put like 2 to 3 stitches. But overall, if you're stitching a flap, you have to put a minimum of 8 sutures so you avoid inducing any folds. And this is the results post-op. Usually it works very well, and you start removing stitches at about 2 to 3 weeks later. So it's more common after enhancement. It stains with fluorescein, scrape beyond the apparent ingrowth, and don't treat the refractive error at the same time because sometimes it can be misleading. So keep in mind, it's not the cells that are under the flap that are the problem, it's the fistula. In my experience, I have not felt the need to use mitomycin, glue, YAG, or alcohol. Usually scraping works very well for me, but I know that others have had success with these modalities. And the third element that we will go over today is flap folds. So flap folds are called, different names, folds, stria, and all that. I call them visually significant or not visually significant. And to know that, you refract. So every time you see a fold and you wonder whether you need to do something about it, refract. Many times the fellows will see patients on the first day and will tell me, oh, I have a patient with folds. And I say, what's the vision? And they tell me 20/30. And I'm like, did you refract? So that's the first thing to do. And because sometimes it's not the fold, it's just under correction or overcorrection. On occasion, you have folds because of trauma, like in this case, finger to eye. And then what happens is that the flap is folded and you have epithelial cells that are grown over the folds and in that stromal area. So in that case, you have to debride the epithelial cells to be able to flatten the flap. So this is another example of these folds. And sometimes you can see the folds better if you put fluorescein. And on other situations, you can see the folds better if you look in retroillumination. This is a good example of that. It's on occasion somebody complains of visual problems. So you look, you see the folds, and you're not exactly sure whether the folds are really the culprit or not. So this is one way to do it, is that if sometimes you can have a Maddox rod effect from the folds. So if you have the light being refracted by the folds opposite to the direction of the fold, that can give you the Maddox rod effect and confirm that the folds are the problem. So how do we address them? You can iron them, you can refloat, you can use high photonic saline, and in most situations, this is all you need. But if it goes beyond a few days, then you may need to remove the epithelium on top of the flap, or even suture, and in worse situations, you can do PTK. So what happens is that the epithelium grows over a fold and creates really like a glue. And so it sticks the folds together and becomes very hard to unglue. So this is why epithelial debridement will help. You remove the epithelium and then the flap will flatten very, very nicely. This is an example of long-standing folds that were fixed. So again, I knew here that the breathing of the epithelium alone is not going to be enough. And I knew ahead of time that I needed to place stitches to stretch the flap. So here I put some alcohol to remove the epithelium, and removing epithelium here, you see the folds. They're always more apparent after you remove the epithelium because the epithelium is hiding them. And so then I flatten the folds with an iron. This is called the Pineda iron. And then you just put the flap down, you flatten further, and then I put stitches past at about 40% depth. And you don't really need to go that hard, and you don't need to tie that tight because you want to avoid folds induced by the stitches. And as you can see, the folds are resolved very nicely at the end of the case. So thank you again for your attention. Many of these videos and many others are included in this video book. It's from Slack. So again, I have a small financial interest in this, really too small to matter, but I think you would benefit from many, many situations of LASIK emergencies that are intraoperative complications that will help you, this book will help you to address them. Thank you again for your kind invitation, and I hope that next time we will see each other in person. Thank you.